The year was 2012, and HTC's flagship smartphone was the One X, a device with a beautiful polycarbonate design and ushered the beginning of HTC's premium One series. Well, looming in its shadows and released alongside it was another device called the One S, a more compact handset with a smaller 4.3-inch display to the One X's 4.7 inches. But the interesting thing is, this phone was also very flagship-like in terms of specifications. For example, in the United States, it had the exact same processor as the larger One X. It's the Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Pro, which was a brand new chip at the time, a dual-core 1.5 GHz SoC. It was also backed with the same amount of RAM as the One X at 1 GB and even had the exact same camera on the rear, an 8-megapixel sensor with autofocus. In some ways, though, the One S even bests its larger brother. For example, it housed a full aluminum unibody design compared to the aforementioned plastic unibody of the One X, which was lighter but also a little cheaper feeling, and with everything being precision drilled out of this one-piece aluminum, and in many ways it even inspired the later One M7 in terms of its aluminum design. So in this video, we'll be taking a throwback look at the HTC One S here in 2019. Now, the screen itself is also interesting because HTC is famous for using Super LCD, but this is one of their rare phones that they decided to go with Super AMOLED. The blacks are super punchy and rich, and the contrast just really pops. It offers wide and generous viewing angles, and there's no gap between the glass and the screen underneath. Now, on the left-hand side of the phone, you find access to a micro USB port for charging. Here's another interesting thing about this phone's aluminum unibody construction, was HTC had several different finishes for this handset. The one here, which is in blue, actually came with a gradient finish, which was also just really ahead of its time. It may be a little easier to notice if I put my hand here to block it, but you can see how the bottom portion of the phone looks black or gray versus the top, which is a lot lighter. It slowly transitions to get darker and darker. So for a device from 2012, it really was very forward thinking in terms of its design, just super elegant to look at. Same thing goes even on the front. If we notice, the top panel here is kind of a lighter tone and the bottom here is darker as well. And we are able to actually peel off this top cover, and that reveals a colored interior, blue in our case. It also came in a red color depending on the carrier, where you can pop in your SIM card. Now, otherwise, the top does house a standard 3.5mm headphone jack and also the power on-off switch. Now, if we take a closer look at the software experience next, this came with HTC Sense on top of Android 4.0 ice cream sandwich at the time. Now, unfortunately, this phone is pretty severely out of date in terms of software version. You can still install and upgrade your phone by going to the Play Store, and all of the latest apps can be refreshed. Also, you can just slap a launcher such as Nova Launcher, as we can see here, and have access to the more modern gestures like swiping up that we'll find also on our newer phones. The S4 Pro processor is definitely not really a powerhouse CPU anymore, even though back in 2012 it was the benchmark king. However, you can see here that in terms of daily navigation and just moving around the home screens, things are still relatively snappy and responsive. Now, part of the reason probably is because the screen resolution isn't super high, so the phone doesn't have to push around as much pixels and work as hard. In fact, it's only a QHD panel, not to be confused with a Quad HD display that we have today, but it was in fact a little bit lower than 720p. Otherwise, again, we're hiding the HTC Sense interface with the Nova Launcher, but if we jump into settings, we can still bring that back, and we can see how it's a very colorful UI as we are navigating around. It also came with Beats Audio Enhancement that's only activated if you use the headphones on the top. And they gave you lots of different options that you could tweak around to make the phone feel different depending on the environment you were in. There are also lots of built-in wallpapers, which were very colorful and really shows off the vibrancy of this panel. So let's say I like this blue gradient wallpaper. So let's start by revisiting the camera on this phone, and it's an 8-megapixel sensor. As aforementioned, the big trick at the time was the ability for you to record HD quality video, but at the same time capture images while recording video. Believe it or not, that was a function that was pretty novel at the time. Furthermore, the camera actually came with HDR built on in, so it was along the first generation of phones with high dynamic range that really punches up the contrast. The phone came with a dedicated image processing chip, which allowed it to take burst shots just by long holding for a few seconds, and you can even choose the best photo afterwards. These were all aspects of its software and hardware performance that devices around the same time didn't really offer. And revisiting some of these images, as long as you hold steady and you are in a well-lit environment, it still is a surprisingly capable camera. Again, you're not going to get the highest technical sharpness just because it's only 8 megapixels, but overall there's plenty more to a camera than just the resolution. Things like contrast and color are all represented very well, and for the most part the capture speeds are also quite fast. So I would say that this camera might be even better than the One M7's camera, which is saying something considering this is also an older phone. Another image here of the sky captured using the HDR mode, and again it's managed to capture plenty of the layers and the shadows within the clouds represented very well. And again, some more shots here of the leaves, still getting again plenty of detail if you zoom in and hold still when capturing your shots. Of course, loading back speeds, as we can see here, is definitely going to be longer than on our newest phones. We have to wait for a bit longer for things to completely render, but once they do open, it still is relatively smooth when it comes to scrolling along, and we can still see the currently open applications here in the background. Takeaway is the audio quality is alright, especially for a rear-facing mono speaker. It does get muffled up a little easily if you're holding it like this, but as a whole it does get plenty loud and does fill up small rooms without too many issues. Now let's take a quick look at its web browsing performance next. We can try using Chrome. Chrome, at least on this latest version, is a bit more intensive on RAM and the processing power needed, so occasionally you will get some moments of hesitation or crashing, which the other browsers, which are more lighter and optimized for low-end hardware, does seem to perform a little bit better these days. Overall, the specs on this thing in 2019 standards is very close to, say, an Android Go edition phone, so a budget device. Again, those phones today also have 1 GB of RAM or so. So if it was running on a slightly more optimized version of applications, it can still do quite good. For the most part, web browsing speeds are still better than expected. Again, it's not going to be lightning fast compared to on the latest flagship phones from today. Again, some hesitation there as it's transitioning, but for the most part, it still is quite good once the page is more or less loaded. So overall, web browsing is still perfectly passable on this phone. Not too bad at all, especially with good antenna reception and still decent overall loading speeds. As long as you don't expect instantaneous performance, it still is surprisingly usable. Now, one of the disappointing aspects of the phone would probably be the bloatware. Again, there's a lot of applications here which are installed from the carrier that unfortunately we can't seem to uninstall, such as this 100% HD gaming, which just looks like spam, but if I long hold on it, you can see that there's no way to really uninstall it or delete it compared to apps that I've installed myself, like Firefox. I can long hold and see the uninstall option. Even if you go into settings on the phone, again, that's certain applications which are included out of the box can't be easily removed. So we have lots of these like Dropbox, even Facebook, which although seem like applications that maybe you'll never use, are unfortunately unable to be uninstalled very easily. Other ones that you've done yourself, again, do have this option. There are a few from HTC which are quite handy, such as their weather application, which as you can see here has a pretty nice visualization of weather conditions across different cities. There's also a notes application also made by HTC that allows you to integrate voice memos along with some quick notes that you may want to do, and even sync it with Evernote if you want to. I can even draw and annotate, and it will be saved as an image, and I can also do things like voice recordings up top. There is also a calculator app that looks very interesting with these oversized keys. It takes advantage of the AMOLED display by making the background dark, which actually looks very good. Kind of reminds me of Windows Phone, in fact. There's also an HTC flashlight app that allows you to control the brightness of the LED torch simply by tapping on these keys. And there's even a car mode that you can tap on, which switches the screen to the horizontal view, has the classic HTC oversized clock widget, and gives you easy click commands for accessing the dialer, playing back some music, or accessing the Google Maps for navigation. And again, any of the applications that you can find, as long as the space for the storage permits it, can be installed without too many issues. Simpler 2D typed games such as Stack do in fact load, just expect some more moments of occasional hesitation and perhaps longer loading speeds when you're opening up the app for the first time. But otherwise, everything is still perfectly playable, and again, the AMOLED display with its rich colors and wide viewing angles still makes it a pretty enjoyable overall experience. The S4 Pro combined with the smaller and less pixel sharp screen means that the battery life is actually still pretty good. Even though it's non-user replaceable, I found that it can still last me through easily a day, if not 2 to 3 days of use here in 2019 before I needed to recharge it again, which is really on the long side for something that's so lightweight and thin. Ending this video, let's just do a quick size comparison with some even older HTC phones in the past, which some, again, do use aluminum, but you can tell how the HTC One S really is a lot thinner by comparison. It's a lot closer to our modern flagship phones here in 2019, and again, it really was the beginning of the HTC One family. And if you're really curious, you can learn more details about this phone as well in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a trip down memory lane, revisiting the HTC One S, again, really the same as the HTC One X in terms of the performance here in 2019.